Brilliant. Okay, thanks very much, Olga. Yeah, just to start off, I'd like to thank yourself, Olga, and Benedict and the MARE Foundation for the opportunity to speak today. We've been working with you sort of quite closely on and off for the last couple of years, and it'd be really good, sort of going forward to continue that relationship. It's been very valuable, I think. So just to give a quick introduction, my name's Matt Skelhorn, and along with my colleague, Dr. Polly Hill, we are responsible for managing the UK Ministry of Defence Legacy Wreck Management Programme. Now today I'll be talking, basically giving you a sort of a brief introduction to that programme, and then I'll be handing over to Stuart Leather from Waves Group to talk specifically about the case study that we'll be focusing on, that of the World War II tanker RFA WAR MEHTAR, which lies off our east coast and has been causing us a few challenges over the last couple of years. So Stuart and Waves Group were brought in to provide the sort of specialist survey expertise that we needed, didn't have in-house, to understand the problems posed by that wreck, fully work out whether it had oil or not, and sort of suggest ways forward in its management. So just to give you a quick overview of what I'll be discussing today. First of all, a brief introduction to the programme, why we manage wrecks. I'm not going to, how we manage wrecks really. I'm not going to go into the sort of details of why we manage them. It's been quite useful following on from Benedict and Matt Carter. I think they've done a really good job of explaining why wrecks are a problem. I'll then be talking briefly about our methodology, how we go about dealing with them, then handing over to Stuart, the main event really, and then coming back at the end just to talk about some of the upcoming wrecks we're looking at, some of the project work that we're going to be focusing over the next 2, 3, 4 years, however long for, and then obviously questions at the end. Okay, so SALMO and the UK MOD Wreck Management Programme. We are responsible for managing a global inventory of around about 5,500 wrecks. We start considering that they may be a problem after 1870. So any wreck after 1870 falls on our list of things that could cause an issue. We have categorised them into those that you think might be more of a problem than others. So I think sort of Matt's mentioned earlier on. But this slide just provides an overview of the inventory. As you can, most of our wrecks come from the First and Second World War. You can see HMS Royal Oak in the centre there, which is this sort of iconic battleship, which we've been working on. It was sunk up in Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands in 1939, and it's been one of those sort of iconic problem wrecks that I think has been, sort of the real catalyst for our programme developing, but maybe also elsewhere as well. We manage wrecks right down to the present day, really. So our most recent concentration of potentially problematic wrecks are those from the Falklands War back in 1982. And you can see on the bottom right-hand side of the screen there, HMS Coventry from that conflict. So we go pretty much really up to date, right up to date. Although most of the wrecks that we're concerned about are, if you like, purpose-built warships, we're also actually responsible for a lot of wrecks that started life as merchant vessels, because in both world wars, the Admiralty, right at the start of the conflict, started requisitioning merchant tonnage to act in an auxiliary military capacity. So on the top right-hand side of the screen there, you can see HMS Jarvis Bay. Now, Jarvis Bay in the 1920s and 30s was a fairly sort of standard civilian liner, but at the start of the war was requisitioned by the Admiralty, the predecessor of the Ministry of Defence, had some guns put on her and was sent out as an auxiliary warship, an armed merchant cruiser, and ended up being sunk in the North Atlantic. The real, I suppose, sort of problem set of wrecks that we're responsible for belong to the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. The RFA has been in existence since the early years of the 20th century. It still carries on now. And one of its roles, or its main role, is sort of fleet logistics, fleet supply, and oil refuelling. And it carries on that role right down to the present. So that's where all our oil tankers are concentrated. And down the bottom left-hand side there, you can see one of those tankers, RFA Bordale. Now, this was sunk in 1940, so during the war, but not actually as a result of the conflict. It actually hit a rock in Norwegian waters, and a Norwegian counterpart got in there and removed the from that wreck several years ago. And just in the last few years, we have taken the oil off one of the sister ships of the Bordale, rather, RFA Darkdale, down in the South Atlantic. I mentioned our remit is worldwide. We are very, very thinly spread. Just in the last few years, we've conducted operations up in Iceland, down to the South Atlantic with Helene and the Darkdale, over to the Far East off Malaysia, and we've carried out some work as well in the Pacific. So yeah, there's an awful lot to deal with. Although today we are focusing a little bit closer to home. Now, it's worth pointing out that within the UK, wreck management is split between two different departments. So we look after, if you like, the warship side of things, the military aspects, but then our Department for Transport and my counterpart down there, Dr. Sam Farnham, is attending the conference today. They look after the merchant wrecks and the potential issues that they cause. So we work very closely together. We've got a good relationship. And one of the reasons for that is there is a degree of overlap between what we do. I've already mentioned those merchant ships that were taken up for service by the Admiralty in the wars, but also when we start looking into some of the other merchant ships, you find sometimes the DFT, Department for Transport, might own the hull of a wreck, but it turns out the cargo might be an Admiralty cargo, and therefore it gets really quite interesting and confusing as to who's actually responsible for doing what. Okay. I think everybody's seen something similar like this. Everybody who works on wrecks will have their own version of the database. Underpinning the work is a geographic information system with the wrecks database, in our case derived from our UK Hydrographic Office. What you see down here in this slide is all of the wrecks that we're aware of in the UK EEZ. Obviously, it doesn't just stop there, it goes all over the place as well. Unfortunately, they're not all our responsibility, but you get that idea just the sheer density of wrecks out there. One of the real issues and the challenges that we're experiencing now is just this idea that in assessing them, in many, many cases, we don't have a wreck on the seabed, whether they've been lost deep ocean or a little bit more remotely. You may have a sinking position, which may have been more or less accurate, but you haven't actually got a tangible wreck. So assessing those can be a bit of a challenge. Okay, so what do we manage? Firstly, the oil side of life. Obviously, oil is a major concern and a major consideration, and has really been a driver for us doing something about wrecks really from the start of the programme. The wreck you can see here is Royal Oak. This is one of the iconic multi-beam images that often gets used when we talk about polluting wrecks. Again, it was conducted by some external contractors. ADAS did a fantastic job of doing this multi-beam shot here. It's now several years old. It's 2006. And this wreck, it started leaking oil up in the Orkney Islands back in the mid-1990s. It's been there since 1939. Back in 39, it had been torpedoed by several torpedoes. Didn't really cause a problem for sort of 50, 60 years, but from the mid-1990s, starts to cause an issue. You see this slide here. These are some air photographs taken in the late 1990s of some of the oil coming off at that time. And for anybody who knows the Orkney Islands, they're a sort of pristine marine environment, home to lots of species and bits and pieces, and this is really bad news. So the early efforts to deal with the oil coming off the strip really sort of focused on trying to contain it. But it was realised after a period of time that that wasn't the solution, and what we really need to do was go in there and get the oil off of the wreck. So in the mid-1990s, the MOD held its hand up and said, we are responsible for the pollutants from this wreck. And of course, by virtue of doing that, it effectively opened Pandora's box, and we became responsible for dealing with all the other pollutants from Ministry of Defence wrecks. That said, it wasn't until about 2009, 2010, a dedicated wreck management programme was established in Salvage and Marine to actually deal with a wider inventory. And from the early 2000s, my counterparts in the rest of the organisation were involved in getting down to that wreck and conducting hot tap operations to remove the oil over a series of years. We're now in a management phase of the wreck. We haven't done any intervention for quite a while now, but we will need to go back to it at some point. It's a very, very complicated wreck. There's a large number of sort of Royal Navy personnel were lost in the sinking. It's full of ammunition, so it has to be treated really quite carefully. We don't want to smash the wreck up to try and get to some of those oil tanks. It has to be treated with a degree of caution. So that's the oil side of things. Now, ammunition. This is a growing area of concern for us. It's pretty fair to say that we haven't done much work on it previously. Oil has been a focus. Ammunition is becoming more of a concern. And there are three strands, I think, to why ammunition is really an issue. So to illustrate this, what you see here is one of our battle cruisers from the First World War, HMS Queen Mary, which was sunk at the Battle of Jutland. And this wreck has been the subject of illegal salvage in the last few years, along with really quite a number of other wrecks from that conflict. And we're also seeing similar activity, particularly in the Far East. It's been really quite damaging. Now, there are real concerns about the impact of that activity on, for example, the archaeological and heritage value of the sites, the fact that they're disturbing, the last resting site of sailors and so forth. But from our point of view, we're concerned about the potential safety and environmental concerns. We know that smashing up these wrecks can lead to oil leaks, not so much from Queen Mary, she didn't have much oil on, she was primarily a coal vessel. But what you can see here is one of the series of photographs taken by some of the salvors who were involved in this illegal activity, which they then subsequently posted online, bizarrely. But what you can see on the deck here of the salvage vessel is a load of cordite rods from ammunition. Those are still viable. And those cylindrical tubes in the centre of the photograph are what are called Clarkson cases. And they were used to convey ammunition, or rather charges, up from the magazine to feed the gun. So they would have had sort of explosive material in them. So it's just this idea that in smashing through the wreck to get high value items that they can sell on for sort of scrap metal value, these people are going through magazines, which seems a crazy idea. So there's a risk there of blowing themselves up, albeit we're not aware that anybody's done that yet. What we're also seeing, though, another aspect of the sort of ammunition concern is this idea that divers may interact perfectly innocently. They're not going out there to rip wrecks apart, but interact with ammunition, and that's causing concerns. What we're seeing in the UK amongst our own sort of MOD legal team is concerns about the liabilities potentially to the MOD of this kind of activity. If somebody accidentally injures themselves, are we on the hook for that? Again, it's a growing concern, not just here, but in other parts of the world as well. So in this example, you can see SS Saganaga. Now, this was a merchant vessel sunk in Canadian waters in the Second World War. And like most merchant vessels in both the First and Second World Wars, she would have carried a limited deck gun armament. Nothing of the league of what was carried in a warship, and certainly not so much ammunition. But nonetheless, this wreck was a popular recreational diving site, and the Canadian government were concerned about the idea that divers coming into contact with ammunition. And so 18 months, 2 years ago, the Royal Canadian and removes the ammunition from the wreck. Now, we haven't done anything really similar like that in UK waters, but if you can imagine sort of 15, 20, 30 years ago, people weren't so concerned about the oil aspects, concerns associated with wrecks. We're just wondering if this is going to be something that's going to grow some legs and is going to be a concern going forward. The other aspects of wreck ammunition, which I don't have a slide to illustrate, is this idea of not so much the bang problem associated with them, but the idea that where you've got concentrations of ammunition, be they sort of sea dumped munitions, which is a lot of in the Baltic and in UK waters as well, but also where you've got lots of ammunition concentrated on wrecks in magazines, the idea that the chemicals from these munitions might leak out and, for example, get into the food chain and cause some real problems. Now, this is a really sort of, I think, quite a new area of research and concern. We're seeing lots of concern about it in the Baltic. It's something my colleague is very sort of interested in and following closely. We don't know where this is going, but if it becomes a real issue, we need to be on top of it and ahead of the game. And then there are all the other hazards as well. Now, I think lots of people on this call will be aware of U-864, the German submarine with mercury cargo in Norwegian, which has been causing really a lot of issues over the last few years. Well, we kind of patted ourselves on the back and said, we don't have to worry about like that in UK waters. And then just about 18 months ago, this story pops up. It's a wreck off the Channel Islands, so just off the coast of France. It's a German Second World War minesweeper / mine layer. A wreck which, quite frankly, wouldn't have been too much concern for us, quite a small thing. And recreational divers went down onto the site, and lo and behold, there's mercury. Now, we don't know the quantities, we don't know why it's there. Technically, it's not our responsibility, but what it's highlighted to us is that, things that you perhaps don't think might be so much of an issue, when you start delving into the wrecks, you start finding out what divers are coming across, you realise you might have something of real concern on your hands. So just be aware that even the most benign wrecks could have a few issues associated with them. So methodology, how we deal with the wrecks through this. We've got a database underpinning everything. That allows us to focus in on those wrecks that we think are real problem, the oil tanks and so forth. And then we go through a 3-stage process. So stage 1, the historical best-based assessment is written on them. That's getting out to the archives, trying to find out as much as possible about the ship and the circumstances of its loss. And then CFAS, a few times during these presentations, Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Agriculture Science, the UK government marine and freshwater science experts, they will conduct on our behalf what we call an environmental desk-based assessment. So they do the so what side of things. We go, okay, well, we've got a wreck in this locality. We think it's got X amount of oil on it. CFAS will do all the clever modelling and go, okay, well, maybe this is more of a problem or not. That allows us then to move on to stage 2 for those wrecks, which are a real problem. I'm not going to dwell on that in too much detail because that's what Stuart will be talking about in regards to WAR MEHTAR later on. But basically getting out and surveying the wreck. And then stage 3 for the really problem ones, going and doing an intervention. Now, to date, we've only intervened on 2 wrecks. I think that's going to change in the near future. And fortunately, those 2 wrecks, HMS Royal Oak, RFA Darkdale down in St Helena, have been shallow enough that we've been able to use surface supply divers, our own team and contracted in divers to conduct operations. I think the wrecks we're looking at now, they're darker, they're deeper. You're going to be having to do these sort of operations with ROVs and or saturation divers, so much more expensive. There you can see one of our divers working on the Darkdale to remove some of the oil. And we try to do things as properly as, sort of with as much respect as possible. You know, these wrecks were the last resting place for a lot of sailors. We try to minimise our disturbance to them when we're planning any operation. We're trying as much as possible to avoid areas where there might be human remains. We'll do things like this. We'll run up the ensign, as here on the Darkdale. This is a mark of respect. You know, we'll lay a wreath over the site, that kind of thing. It's just, you know, making sure that our footprint on that wreck, our respect for the integrity of the archaeology, the heritage, you know, its status as a resting place for sailors is respected. Okay, so the WAR MEHTAR, this specific case study. Here's a WAR MEHTAR here. There aren't too many photographs of it afloat. It was launched in 1919, just after the First World War. Went straight into RFA service. It's a tanker, and it and this vessel and its sister ships from the war class, they survived through into the late 1930s, and by that time, quite frankly, they're really on their last knockings. They're quite old. They are, you know, really quite dilapidated, and they were due to be scrapped. But because of the worsening international situation at that time, they were retained in service and, you know, saw good service throughout the war. Now, this particular vessel, in 1941, it was part of a convoy up our east coast, carrying a cargo of 7,000 tonnes of oil, and it was hit by a single torpedo amidships. It didn't sink straight away. It's taken in tow, and a few hours later, while in tow, it breaks its back and sinks. Fortunately, and very unusually, without any loss of life, everyone gets off this one. So that makes our life easier, makes things a little bit happier. So there's a location, the wreck marked in red. You can see some of the sort of sensitive areas around about marked on the shape files there. Now, right from the start of our program, we've had concerns about this wreck. It's an oil tanker, so that had been a focus of particular interest for us. And we've done quite a lot of preliminary work down the years, so conducting side-scan sonar of the wreck, survey of the wreck to see what condition it was in, doing some initial multi-beam work, doing some environmental sampling round about. And all of the results of this work were kind of telling us that, yeah, you've got an oil tanker there, but it's looking like it's not too much of a problem. We don't think there's too much oil on it, and it looks like it's full of holes. Now, unfortunately, the visibility on the site is appalling. You can't see in front of your face. So trying to get a really sort of accurate picture of what was going on there was difficult, but our suspicion was it wasn't too much of an issue. However, in 2018, our Maritime and Coast Guard Agency called us up and go, hold on, there's oil leaking off your wreck. And here are a couple of photographs of oil escaping from the site at that time. Note what appears to be a sort of brownish sediment plume behind the oil, and I'll come back to that later on. But we suddenly realised that, yes, we'd been doing all this work on this wreck, but we had nothing that definitively proved that this wreck was or wasn't a real issue, and we had nothing to really inform, you know, a full-scale intervention if that was what was required. So at that point, it was slightly panic stations on their part. Fortunately, we were able to contract with Waves Group. And so I'll hand over to Stuart now to sort of like take us through all the good work they did to better understand what was going on with this wreck. So I shall stop sharing the screen there and go from there.
Hello everyone, thanks Matt. I will just hopefully share my screen now. Oh, right, okay, so hopefully you can see my screen now for the next slide. Thanks, Matt, for handing over. Yeah, so as Matt sort of said, the MOD brought us in 2018 to undertake actually our second survey of the War MEHTAR. We were also contracted in 2014 to do a multi-beam survey. And I just thought I'd put this sort of little bit of a chart overlay just to remind us where the ship was. And just to note that the sort of, the depth of water of the vessel is about 35 meters. As Matt's already said, the visibility in the area is pretty appalling. So any sort of, visual techniques for surveying the wreck are pretty limited. And it's also worth noting that the tidal streams in the area are pretty harsh. So you've got, semi-diurnal tides there, but you've got quite harsh current flows, which basically all this is really making the idea of diver intervention quite a challenge. So therefore, the obvious answer is using remote sensing technology as much and as far as we can. So hold on, just hopefully this will work. Let's go to the next slide. So as I said, in 2014, we undertook a multi-beam survey, and I thought it's worth mentioning this, only because we were able to utilize quite a unique methodology. The challenge of the War MEHTAR and the depth is that for high resolution multi-beam surveys, the closer you can get your sensors to the seabed or to the asset that you're trying to survey, the better the resolution and the better the data. And the most obvious way of doing that is with a remotely operated vehicle. But in 2014, we tried this unique approach of actually having a small deployable towed vehicle that you can see there on the right of the picture with a multi-beam system on, which we could deploy from a much smaller vessel. So in other words, keeping the costs of this high resolution survey down and trying to minimize them as much as possible. Still not cheap, but a lot cheaper than the solution we came to in 2018 for several reasons that I'll explain. And here's the results from 2014. So quite high resolution, and we were able to use the 2014 data to compare to the 2019 data as we went forward. Okay, so there's an idea of 2014. So in 2019, as Matt said, there was quite a necessity to survey the wreck and get a really good idea about where the oil was coming from. And this was, I think at the initial stages, this was seen as a two-part approach where we'd undertake a survey and then there'd be some form of salvage assessment to assess the quantity of oil on board. And then arguably there may have been a stage 3 where there was an oil removal campaign. So what we did when we thought about it, we actually combined the survey into really a salvage assessment. Okay, so we wanted to quantify the oil, and the solution we came up with was actually combining multi-beam data with a little bit of kit called a Neutron backscatter unit that has been used quite successfully in the salvage industry and also is quite well established on land for measuring oil in tanks. And what a Neutron backscatter unit does is it can remotely sense by putting a bit of kit on the side of a vessel, on the side of a steel plate, how much hydrocarbon is on the other side of the steel plate. In other words, how much hydrocarbon is in your tank. So by combining these two methods, we reckon we get a pretty fair assessment of the quantities of oil left on the vessel. Right, you can see now that to do this though, we had to employ slightly bigger assets than 2014. And we were very fortunate to secure this rather lovely vessel at a relative, and I do use the word relative, quite informally, a relatively good price. But using a vessel like this gives us several advantages. It's got dynamic positioning, so there's no need for anchors or anything. It can work in quite large sea states, so it's ideal for the location of the War MEHTAR, where we're subject to strike quite strong tides, and it can deploy a very large remotely operated vehicle, which was the choice of platform to deploy our multi-beam and also to use the Neutron backscatter unit. Right, and here's just a slight close-up of what we're actually talking about. So there's, on the left is the work class ROV. It was mobilized, as I said, with a dual head, that's 2 multi-beam echo sounders. And then once we'd undertaken the sort of high resolution multi-beam survey, we were then able to put this small little piece of kit on the bottom right there, which is the neutron backscatter unit, to try and ascertain the amount of volume of oil in the tanks, if indeed there was any. Okay, so basically the ROV carried out all the surveys and we were able to swap equipment quite easily in and out. Actually, in the picture you can see there, it's got a sub-bottom profiling system on there, or a magnetometry system on there, a TSS 440, which we didn't use, but unfortunately that's the only photograph we've got. Right, so really what was the specification for the multi-beam survey? Well, we needed full coverage of the wreck, and we needed to get a dense point cloud, in other words, as many points as possible, so we could actually, in effect, get what we could term as a point cloud model of the wreck. And the idea of this, that we could actually assess the integrity of the wreck, and from the multi-beam survey, we could then actually start defining the sampling plan for the neutron backscatter unit. Okay, so we're using a dual head, as I said, 2 multi-beam systems, and that's all positioned very accurately with an inertial navigation system, which all communicates with the ship through an acoustic navigation system, a USBL system. Okay, so the navigation and positioning was the best you can get, so it's a centimetric accuracy almost. And the dual head, they were Reson 7125 multi-beam systems, again, arguably the best in class for industry. Obviously, other manufacturers would argue with me about that, but we're really talking about really top level equipment here. Right, and that's a quick insight into the first bit of multi-beam. So we just ran the ROV as close to the wreck as possible, building up this point cloud model. The coloured bit is obviously the seabed, so you can see how the wreck's slowly being buried into the seabed. Right, and now what we have, another aspect, and what you can see there in the bottom right is a little bit of a comparison. To be honest, it does look a bit grainy, between the 2019 and the 2014 survey. In that midship section where the ship has broken her back, we just identified the differences and identified a little bit of sort of collapse in the structure there. Okay, then after we had, so as I was saying, we used that multi-beam data to really define the sampling plan for the neutron backscatter unit. And so it's very important to note here that we were able to get that multi-beam data processed and in a model, and to start analysing that model within sort of hours of it being acquired on the ship. We didn't have to go ashore or anything like that. So this was all happening in sort of real time. So we were able to define our sampling plan based on that real data of the ship, almost as we acquired the data. Right. And this is how we did it. So we took the GA plans and we, this is a little model, hold on. Yeah, so we took the GA plans, overlaid them on the ship, and then we started really undertaking a structural assessment of the ship, looking at the cargo holds, in other words, where the bulk of the oil was supposed to be, and trying to identify any breaches in the hull where the oil could have escaped. So we were trying to sort of refine our sampling plan and prioritize areas to sample. Oh, hold on. Yeah, so, and this is really what we came up with. So we focused obviously on the hull of the ship. In a way, the ship's superbly sort of positioned on her side for us to undertake, to actually get at the cargo tanks in the most efficient manner. So what you can see there is the GA plans overlaid over the multi-beam data. You can see the points that we defined, which correspond to the 5 cargo tanks. So we went through and sort of systematically sampled each tank at the top, middle and bottom to try and identify where the oil would be sort of isolated. But we weren't sure whether the wreck had a longitudinal bulkhead, which is why we were sort of sampling. You can see we've got sampling stations in the midship part and at the bottom of the wreck, when you would have thought the oil would have drifted to the top. But as I said, we weren't sure whether it had this midship bulk, this longitudinal bulkhead. So we wanted to make sure that we had pretty good coverage, and we were confident that oil wasn't where in any sort of surprising locations. Yeah. So this next slide really gives you an idea of how we use the multi-beam data, not only to plan the NBS sampling regime, but we then used it to guide the ROV with the neutron backscatter unit on board to go to those required locations. Okay, so this is a small video, so it just gives you a sort of flavor. So what we've got is, you know, top middle is the ROV actually going around and being located within our point cloud model with our sampling points on, so we could direct the ROV directly to the points we wanted it to go. Bottom left, we've got cameras of where we are and what we want to, and where we want to put the neutron backscatter unit, so we get an idea of what the hull is and where it wants to go. And the thing I haven't mentioned is, as part of the neutron backscatter unit sampling regime, we had to clean the hull. So we were cleaning areas of hull, then putting the instrument on the hull. And we could see that very clearly on the ROV video there. And then we could actually decide whether we were getting a very good sort of attachment from the equipment or whether it was a bit dodgy. And we were able to see what we noticed were, in some cleaning locations, we're actually losing quite a bit of this sort of outer surface of the wreck and getting down to bare metal. And in other places, the cleaning was quite difficult, which, you know, had an influence on our measurements. Right, and in the top right team, that's just a scanning sonar for when there's no visibility. We've got the general position of the ROV in the middle and then other camera positions. Okay, so you can see now how from that initial multi-beam survey, suddenly we had a lot of geospatial data that could then guide us throughout the rest of the operation. Right, and then here's just a little bit of a close-up about what we actually did. So what you can see here really is those holes in the middle of the screen. You can see that that is actually where plate has actually come off the hull of the wreck. Now, obviously, if you were being critical of the multi-beam, you could say, is that a factor of the multi-beam data, or is that in fact real? Well, we confirmed it was real with the ROV cameras. So that is a direct example of where the cargo holds, that's number 6 hold, had actually been breached where the plate had come off. So we would expect some escape there. And then as we go down to the bottom, we can see that we had sampling points in there again because of this longitudinal bulkhead, but we were able to take samples all around this area to get a really good idea of the measurements we were getting from the MBS system. Right, and here we just get to some results. So the way the neutron backscatter unit works is by firing radiation in through the plate, and then how much of that radiation is reflected back is proportionate to the amount of hydrocarbon on the other side of the plate. And what we'd normally expect is readings of around, as you can see on the sort of the bottom graph there, of around 5,000 to 6,000. Whereas most of our measurements on the WAR MEHTAR were around the sort of 50,000, by the way, I was a decimal point out, do forgive me. Whereas most of the reasons were in the sort of 40,000 mark, which suggests that there was no oil on board. And we also noticed that there was quite a discrepancy in some of those readings, right? And that was, I think, we decided, or when we analysed those sort of locations, that has a lot to do with the amount of structure, the amount of debris, and the amount of cleaning. So that's why I'm just going to go back a slide, actually, very unprofessional in a presentation, but I'm just going to go back a slide. And that's why actually we ended up taking quite a few samples in the 2 slides, actually in this area where the plate had come off. Because what we were doing, we were actually constantly calibrating the neutron backscatter unit for when we knew there was actually water on the other side of the plate. So we were just building our confidence up of the results of the unit. Right, so as a result of that then, we were pretty confident that actually we couldn't find any major repositories of oil within the cargo holds or within the cargo tanks. Okay, and really that was our conclusion of the survey. So through the multi-beam data, we were able to overlay that with ship's plans. We were also able to identify any breaches in the hull, so we got a pretty good idea of the condition survey of the wreck, and therefore we were able to sort of logically trace, right, where oil seepage or cargo loss would have been undertaken. Because we were using the multi-beam to guide us around that wreck, we were also able to clarify and calibrate the MBS in real time, right? But in reality, we didn't find, there was no record of any oil. The NBS did not identify any oil. We did identify some structural collapse, especially since the 2014 survey, and that was obviously that was quite gross collapse. In terms of condition of the plate and that sort of thing, we've been talking a lot about erosion of plate collapse in terms of millimeters. We didn't do any sort of thickness gauge measurements or anything, right? But we are pretty sure that we've had plate beginning to drop off the frames. So therefore, the plate is beginning to sort of degrade pretty rapidly. So that obviously leads us to the big questions about why were we getting leaks on the sea surface? Well, it's from those leaks, I think it's pretty obvious that was quite light oil. So no reports of heavy oil anywhere. In terms of the type of oil, there's no doubt that there'll be oil and lubes in all the sort of engine compartments and associated pipework and in the engine room compartments. But we couldn't identify anything substantial in the cargo holds, as I've already said. And the other question, which I think Matt and Polly are working on, is the surrounding sediment of that wreck, is that saturated with hydrocarbon? So that's a question that needs to be asked. I think Matt is working on. Right, so that's the end of me, as it were. So now I'm going to hand back to Matt just to discuss the MOD's up and coming work. Matt, are you there?
I am, yes. No, thanks very much for that, Stuart. That's very good, thank you. Right, yeah, just to emphasise, we're definitely not saying that there aren't any potential, or there isn't oil remaining on the wreck. But what we're saying is we think the amounts left on there, based on the evidence we're able to gather, is probably about the same as had we conducted an intervention. When we've conducted an intervention in the past, we've always said, you know, we are not guaranteeing we are removing every last drop of oil. To do that, realistically, you're looking at complete wreck removal, and any attempt to do that probably is going to cause more disturbance, release more nasties into the ocean, than maybe just leaving it at a certain point and saying, you know, you've done as much as you reasonably can. You know, risks associated with it are what we call a LARP, a low as reasonably practicable. That said, the wreck is still of interest, and as Stuart's alluded to, there are some unanswered questions. We've been keeping an eye on what Benedict has been doing, particularly with Stuttgart. Now, he's mentioned that earlier on. This idea that in the case of that particular wreck, you've got something that really is very broken down, you know, perhaps a structure that if you just looked at it, you think, well, there can't be too much of a problem associated with that. But then you suddenly realise the seabed roundabout is absolutely saturated with some really very nasty oil. Now, in that case, it is a very nasty oil. It's a sort of synthetic coal-based one. That's not what we're dealing with on the WAR MEHTAR, but we still wonder, is there a possibility that oil could become trapped in the sediments? If you remember back to some of those aerial photographs I showed a little while ago, you could see oil at the surface, but then there also seemed to be what appeared to be sort of an upwelling, these sort of sediment plumes, the brown sediment on the surface. So potentially it's something we'd like to look at in the not too distant future before we sort of close this one completely off of our books. Certainly be an interesting thing to investigate. But for now, what we've got to say is, yes, it's of interest, but we do have other priorities to move on, and it's always this sort of constant battle, you know, how do you prioritise wrecks, which ones you go on to next? So I think Stuart's got the controls for a second. You just flip through to the next slide, please, Stuart. So
there you go.
Thank you very much. The next one we're hoping to look at is this tanker here. Now, this is the SS Disturbance. It's a First World War tanker, so it's over 100 years old now, sunk in 1917 by a single torpedo hit in the stern, and this just lies out North Wales, coast of North Wales. Over on the west side of the country. It sank with about 3,000, just over 3,000 tonnes of oil on it. And I think for a vessel of this age, it is remarkably well preserved. Now, what you're seeing here, this isn't something we've produced. This was a surface-derived multi-beam survey conducted by Bangor and Bournemouth universities. It's actually a clip from a YouTube video. If anybody wants to Google, or YouTube, Google, whatever, SS Disturbance, you'll find it on there. It's a site that is regularly recreationally dived. Been quite a lot of work undertaken by Bangor University on the marine ecosystems on the wreck, but there's no real sort of idea as to whether or not that this may be causing an oil pollution problem or not, or that there may still be hydrocarbons on board. There's no reports of anything coming off of it, but it's something we're hoping to look at later this summer because it is remarkably well preserved. And then Stuart, next slide, please. The other wreck we're going to have a look at in the hopefully thereafter, you know, if perhaps if we had.
So I'm doing my best here.
Oh, sorry, don't worry. If we had a little few more resources, you know, we'd be doing multiple wrecks at a time. But unfortunately, you know, as with every other program, you know, funds are a little bit tight occasionally. This is Prudentia. Again, we haven't conducted this survey. This is conducted, as you can see up the top there, by Bournemouth University and the Sea War Museum. Again, it's available on YouTube. But it is a First World War tanker again, this time up in the Orkney Islands. It is quite ironic that so much attention has been focused on Royal Oak, which is just a very short way away from this wreck, but kind of unnoticed is the fact that there's an oil tanker very close by. Now, this vessel is quite an interesting one. It was lost accidentally. It slips its moorings in a storm back in 1917, drifts, and ends up in the First World War. Scapa Flow was a Royal Navy fleet anchorage, and it actually manages to run across the ram bow of one of our battleships, HMS Jarvis. Big hole ripped in the side, flips over on the seabed, as you can see here. And we know this wreck has been leaking oil in the not too distant past. It's all a little bit anecdotal, you know, a little bit unclear, but we think about 20 years ago, divers, we think local divers, don't know, can't get to the bottom of what actually happened, but they were going down there and they were placing sandbags on the hull to try and staunch some small leaks coming off of it. So it's definitely one we need to look at. But, you know, ideally we'd be looking at more of them in one go. And then after that, well, yeah, there's loads. it's just an ongoing battle. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for that, Stuart.